He who saw into the deep. Probably the most famous opening line of a piece of literature ever. It's actually one of two popular versions of this piece of literature, and it is also the oldest piece of recorded literature, at least by tradition, that we have, the Epic of Gilgamesh, He who saw into the deep. It requires, as you hear that line or as you read it in front of you, some form of interpretation. Even in translation, you have to think about what this might mean and what it might imply. The important thing for our purposes today is not the answer to that question at all, but the fact that we immediately begin to interpret. When we see text, we have to interpret. We don't just absorb it. There was an idea of angelic text, this idea that maybe there is some language that we can use to communicate directly from mind to mind without any kind of loss of meaning, this idea of a perfect language. But there is no such thing. Some might argue that it's mathematics, but mathematics is great for some stuff and not others. Yes, we can talk to aliens, and there's a good chance that in this universe, all aliens have encountered something like pi and something like Euler's number. These feel like they're things that are discovered rather than things that are invented by humans. But there's only so much you can say in pi. Pi speaks softly. And so we are always called upon to interpret the texts that we encounter. We meet it halfway. We bring our own assumptions, expectations, history, prior knowledge, questions, and all the other texts that we've engaged before to the interpretation of every new piece of text that we see. Whether that's ancient poetry, whether it's constitutional law, whether it is something that you're reading that is a scientific text, whether it's a TikTok video, we bring our own interpretation to the text. We engage with it, and we try to see into the deep. Today I'm going to talk about three ways in which we do this. These are not, I should note, these are me. These are not kind of some universally accepted three traditions. So I don't think tradition is the right word. I'm just going to say kind of clusters or groupings that when I think about interpretation, I think about. And so I'll talk a little bit about these long traditions of exegesis and questions of esoteric readings that go into that as well. And then secondly, I'll talk about summarization and indexing and how that led to what we now call information science. And finally, I'll talk about a much more recent tradition, which is content analysis, which probably is only about 100 years old now, but seeks to datafy other forms of text so that it can be used in ways to compare more easily. These groups of ways of thinking about texts are not, like I said, they're mine, I think. I don't think that they're widely accepted as being groupings, and part of the reason for that is I think they overlap in various ways. They're not clean categories, but at least for the process of introducing you to some of them, I think they'll work for now. They're also combining to a much greater degree today. I don't think we could draw clean lines as easily today as we have been able to do in the past. They're also central to the practices of information studies, and they are also a large part of what we now throw under a broad label of artificial intelligence. A lot of what we call artificial intelligence is large language models, and large language models are the outcome of the long human engagement with the process of interpreting and synthesizing and summarizing texts. So this is a big topic. I'll try to not have it kind of run too far off the rails as I go through it. So the first of these traditions or groups, as I noted, is this idea of reading as interpretation. The act of reading always requires interpretation, even when you choose not to analyze a text, even if you're reading for pleasure or reading for fun, or you pick up a pamphlet or you see a billboard. All of these require, for you to bring to the text your idea of what at face value means, right? A face reading of something, a simple reading of something still requires you to put an interpretive framework around it. The Greek word exegesis actually means to lead out. So exegesis is the process of extracting meaning from a text. You do this through kind of careful reading, through analysis, through looking at pieces of the text in detail, questions to draw a little bit from a semiologist that came much later, drawing questions about which order in which something is presented, the narrative question. You can talk about the kinds of choices that the author may have made. Why did they choose to use this word and not another? Looking very much at detail, at detailed use of language, but also through looking at the framework that surrounds the text itself, the historical framework, the rhetorical choices, the moral assumptions, the metaphysical understandings. All of these are inscribed into the text itself, or you use it as part of your interpretive process, or you're drawing together other people who've used their own contexts for their own commentaries and adding that into the mix. So it's a big soup of meaning that you have to kind of sort through and piece together to make sense of any text. This might sound like what you did in high school with a poem from E. Cummings or from T.S. Eliot, right? You've been given a snippet of a poem and you've been asked to analyze it. This is literary criticism, this idea of looking at the text and trying to figure out what the literary significance of it is. And that is a fairly modern version of this process. The actual exegesis of texts goes back as long as we've had texts, that is, as long as we've had history. History is built on this process of commentary. And some of the earliest examples of systematic textual interpretation come from ancient Mesopotamia. Archaeologists have found now thousands of clay tablets that are not the original works in the sense that we use that, but often commentaries, interpretive texts written centuries after the originals. In fact, we started with Gilgamesh, and the Epic of Gilgamesh. We only call it Gilgamesh because of some of the Akkadian interpretations of the original Sumerian text, because we wouldn't know how to say the original Sumerian text. Whether we actually know how to say the Akkadian is a really interesting question, but at least we have a guess at this word being pronounced as Gilgamesh, right? Or some kind of version of that. And the only reason we know that is because we read it through that Akkadian. But that wasn't just Gilgamesh. It wasn't just sort of stories. It was a lot of what we know about myth, about cosmology, about law, about social practice. A lot of that came out of this interpretive practice and the commentaries around this, people arguing about the meaning of particular stories or laws. And so we get that from the layers and layers of interpretation that happen later than the original text was even produced. This is a recurring pattern in the way that humans develop knowledge. We don't often inherit the text itself, but the conversation around the text. One of the examples of how we do this, and maybe the one that you're most familiar with, is kind of religious exegesis. This is where I think it's most visible in our own history and most explicit, and especially in practices of rabbinic Judaism. This idea that sacred texts are inseparable, inescapable from their interpretations. So the Torah exists alongside centuries of commentary in various forms, debate, alternative interpretations. That meaning is not fixed. It continues today, and so people still discuss the ancient law within the context not just of modern interpretation, but also in the context of thousands of years of people arguing, of discussing and arguing and debating the meanings present in various texts and in various commentaries. It's the meaning of the text and its religious and political and structural social impact is created through this discussion, created through these commentaries, produced in the process of interpretation and argument. Later interpretations don't replace earlier ones for the most part, and this is true of most religious traditions. They don't kind of replace or displace earlier interpretations. They accrete, they build upon them over time. Christianity and Islam developed their own similar kinds of traditions of discussion around the texts. Kind of early church fathers, theologians throughout the medieval period, Islamic jurists, all produce huge bodies of interpretive writing focused on sometimes very small passages and extracting or mining out the meaning of those small passages of text. Whole schools of thought, whole divisions, whole religious traditions emerge over disagreements over small pieces, over whether the blood of Christ once consecrated, whether the wine actually becomes the blood of Christ, or whether that is a metaphor, whether it is literal or metaphorical. Or any other small slices of divisions within any of these religious traditions. Small differences in phrasing, grammar, metaphor, let alone choices of how something is interpreted from one language to another, end up having huge effects on those religious traditions. But this overlaps also into our secular philosophical traditions. A lot of Western philosophy and Eastern philosophy and kind of philosophical traditions throughout there's not this clean break between kind of religious and secular thought. That said, if you look at the history of Western philosophy, particularly early Greek philosophical texts, they don't start out as texts, right? A lot of what we know about this is through the discussions and commentaries on those texts. I mean, if you look at the core of this, the kind of Socrates to Plato to Aristotle, we don't have anything that is even pretended to be written by Socrates. We have Plato interpreting him, and then really we have Aristotle interpreting Plato in many ways. And in fact, we really are drawing our ideas of this from texts that follow hundreds of years after this. Like, we don't have an authoritative copyright date on Aristotle, or on, what's the copyright date for the Republic? When is that written? And we don't, right? We kind of piece it together through commentaries and certainly very early versions of some of these, right? You can find very early versions of what you might assume is an authoritative version of these texts. But often we're just trying to kind of piece together what they meant through, when we talk about lacunae, we're usually talking about gaps in the text itself, a word or two missing. But we also have these huge traditions that we know only through people saying, well, I'm not this dude. Like, look at all the stuff this dude says that's wrong. And all we know about this dude is all the stuff that other people have said about and said that he said that was wrong. So we have whole chunks of that missing, but we can reconstruct it somewhat because people keep talking about it for hundreds and thousands of years afterwards. This isn't limited to the Western tradition, of course, even though we have kind of that for, say, Aristotle. Confucian texts are often taught through layers of explanation as well. Foundational Indian philosophical sutras are often so compressed that they're really unintelligible without that interpretation. And again, to bring it back to the European tradition, that is one of the central breakpoints of Christianity in Europe, which is this question of whether only a priestly class should be able to interpret the texts, or whether that should be open to a lay class to make sense of and bring their own interpretations to those texts. Should you be allowed to read a translation of a religious text in your own language, in the Vulgate, and then try to make sense of it, or should you leave that to the experts, the priestly class, who have spent years and years reading this in the original, whatever that original might be, but perhaps in Latin or in Greek or in Hebrew, right, or in a number of other potential other languages, right, that some of the early texts and early commentaries were written in. Can you really be Christian if you've only read the Bible in English? Is kind of the central way you might ask that question. So just to be clear here, those kinds of commentaries carry a huge amount of weight. I think I may have kind of indicated this, right? So that question over how to interpret the Bible kind of drives the Reformation and leads us into questions that happen during the Enlightenment and are tied into issues of technology and publication, and questions over how society is or should be organized. All of these are built up around questions of interpreting central texts. And in all of these cases, the authoritative text is inseparable from its interpretive ecosystem. In other words, we aren't, even if we could get at original texts, as we can with, say, the Constitution, for example, of the United States, we have original copies of that. It wasn't written that long ago with comparison to some of these other things we're talking about. But that alone does not give us the tools that we need to interpret it. We need to think about the broader ecosystem in which it is interpreted. This means asking questions about who it is that wrote a text. How many of Paul's letters were written by Paul? How many of Shakespeare's plays were written by Shakespeare? Who is it that actually wrote this text? When did they actually write it? We make assumptions about texts that seem to be at a particular point in a period in time, but may very well have been recorded a year or a decade or centuries after the events being described actually occurred. And so is this person who's writing in the first person really the first person recording this, or are they just kind of echoing an oral tradition, for example? Who is it written for and why? What audience was this intended for? Were we the intended audience? Often not. Certainly not personally, right? So who was it that this was being written for, and how did they interpret it sort of at the time? Some of this is historical, right? How do you draw this out of history? Do you want to try to figure out how people were interpreting these words when they were written and what they said about that interpretation? Or do you want to draw on the context of the present time or the commentaries that have happened between the two, right? Was this written? What were the social constructs? What were the social constrictions that were shaping this? So can you understand the Constitution if you don't understand some of the discussions over liberal values that are being directly encoded in it? Can you understand it without understanding that it is the historical context of a colony trying to break away from colonial rule? You have to have that context to kind of bring an interpretation that makes sense to it. Again, just to go back to the Constitution, this is obviously an ongoing debate throughout the history of how we use the Constitution in the United States. There are societies that gather around the idea of wanting to kind of get at the original intent of the authors of the Constitution and the ways in which those who were alive at the time might have interpreted that intent. These are, for them, the only correct way of understanding the Constitution, and therefore the United States as an entity, is through authorial intent of the framers. And then there are those who would say, wow, that's a really weird way to think about this, to completely throw away any option of recognizing scientific development since the 18th century, or the idea that somehow really kind of archaic ideas around race or gender that were encoded into the Constitution should limit how we interpret it today. So that's another kind of school of thinking about the way the Constitution works. We have some of the things we've been talking about in terms of commentary and building upon earlier commentaries are really written into how we make use of our Constitution in the U.S. legally. We actually have a tradition of stare decisis at the Supreme Court. This idea that even though you may overturn earlier decisions, you have to do so in such a way that you can't just make up new law, right, or new interpretations. You have to be reversing earlier interpretations or building on them, or engaging in this process called casuistry, where you're kind of trying to draw lines between them and weigh them in various ways, right? So, but that process is actually in code. That's how our laws work in the U.S. system, at least. That we have this explicit expectation that interpretation built on many decades and centuries of earlier decisions and earlier arguments is how we actually decide what's legal today. And there is a tradition that is not really found, hopefully, with some very weird exceptions, in the U.S. legal tradition, but in exegesis more broadly, which is this idea of the esoteric interpretation of texts. So alongside public, explicit drives towards really trying to get at the understanding and assuming that there is one best way of reading a text, there is this idea that there are more than one, that there's more than one interpretation of a text, and that built into this, especially in the esoteric tradition, and that the author intended there to be multiple interpretations of that text. This, to go back to one of the longest kind of and deepest traditions in the Western Western history around this, if you look at the Jewish tradition, you also have the Kabbalistic, the Kabbalah, the idea of reading into the text esoteric meaning. And you have this also among those who do numerology from the Bible and a bunch of other kinds of pieces. And there's lots of ways this might be engaged, right? So one is to look at some of the metaphors that are, there are metaphors that are very explicit, but then maybe there are deeper metaphors that we've missed. We'll talk in a second about one example of this from Machiavelli, for example. But maybe there are deeper metaphors here where, because of the context in which the document is being written, saying exactly what you mean in a way that is immediately grokkable, that is immediately graspable, is politically dangerous. So you have to kind of hide the meaning within the text. That's the assumption among those who engage in esoteria. And so you really want to kind of figure out methods of uncovering, drawing out this deeper meaning that's been hidden there by the authors, by the people, or in one example, by gods or demons that have hidden knowledge underneath the text. And so, so you might look for patterns within that, numerical patterns, symbolic patterns, metaphorical patterns that you can then use to unlock the key that's hiding something within this text. Some of this happens particularly within, I mentioned kind of demons as authors. This is, we don't want to go too far astray here on this, but there is an alchemical tradition in the West. We also talk about Indian and Chinese alchemy. Alchemy is this idea of getting at the base meanings of substance, of physical substances. This is kind of many would argue that especially Western alchemy was the place in which science began in the Western tradition. And so you are trying to uncover, you're kind of taking this long process of exegesis of texts and then applying it to physical systems. But also within that alchemical tradition is this idea of a hermetic practice of not recording your notes. People who were engaged in alchemy would often come up with their own languages, their own note-taking process to make sure others couldn't read what they'd written. But the major hermetic texts were said to have hidden meaning within them, so that if you were a lay observer, you would read this and it might not make a lot of sense at all, or it might just seem like a simple storybook, but there were kind of patterns underneath that where you kind of hid the good stuff. Or as some of the tradition suggested, that some demons had shown up on Earth and hidden some of the good stuff in some of these hermetic texts. These are texts often that are kind of are commentaries on the real texts, or are duplicates, or somehow re-recording texts that had been found, or translations of texts that have been found, but the found piece is false. They are pseudotexts. So, somebody found, somebody dug up something in a chest in a field, and that's where the originals were. But the originals were easily broken. They were, on clay plates, or they were on, papyri, and they fell apart. But just luckily, someone just in time managed to scribble down something or translate it from some other language and into something that we could all read in our common language. This was pretty common towards this idea of hermetic texts, this idea of a pseudotext. But in these cases, obscurity isn't the flaw, right? It's built into it, that these are deliberately meant. These are kind of what we would now call polysemic texts. These are texts that have multiple meanings by intention. One of these more recent esoteric traditions comes out of the writings of a political philosopher named Leo Strauss, who spent the last half of his career at the University of Chicago. He was a part of the group that left Austria and Germany and elsewhere ahead of the Nazis. He was because he was Jewish, and so he came over and ended up at some of the same places that some of the Frankfurt schoolers did. He originally ended up at the New School in New York City for a bit. Well, he originally ended up in London, but then at the New School and eventually at the University of Chicago. But he was not a Frankfurt schooler. His work probably had heavy influence on people like Walter Benjamin, but broadly speaking, I think he was kind of his own entity. And his central argument was that people writing in the classical tradition, and this was probably from about Plato to about Machiavelli, were intentionally concealing their true views. That because writing openly could be dangerous, and that was clearly true of Machiavelli, who could be kind of blamed for writings that might be considered against the church. And we know that it was true for Plato, because the hemlock was the proof in the pudding there. That because of this, classical writers almost always had to write, the phrase he uses is write between the lines. We often talk about reading between the lines, which is what we all do to a certain extent when we're engaged in interpretation. But for Strauss, people had to write between the lines. They hid the deeper meaning away from the hoi polloi, away from the everyday reader, leaving it only to those who were more serious about the way they were interpreting it, serious scholars who could make sense of it. So for Strauss, readers had to read between the lines. They had to look at not just what was said, but what was omitted, what was downplayed, looking for oddly phrased things to see if it might be opening up a key to figure out what was happening. He was a big fan of Nietzsche, and Nietzsche, I think, if you had to make an argument for anyone writing in with hidden meanings, I think Nietzsche would be it. I mean, it's hard to read something like Auslands Praxis und Ausrüstung or any of his greater works and not say, okay, wait, no, this is not just a story about a guy dancing in the woods, right? In that case, you have very explicit metaphors, but his argument is that if you look at anything within the philosophical tradition, people are really writing in such a way that only serious scholars can get at it. This sounds like it's a great argument for what I say is right and what everyone else says is wrong, but I think that would be too simplistic a take on Strauss. I do think that he has had, I mean, not everybody knows. I mean, I think a lot of people, especially in the last decade or so, the political influence of Straussians, who really, people who came out of the University of Chicago and were taught by people who had studied under Strauss, might actually refer to themselves as Straussians. And that had a huge influence on the development of a new form of conservatism in U.S. politics. And so those neoconservatives have had a huge influence on the political life of the U.S. And therefore, I think a lot of people today now think of Strauss. Now, I don't know that Strauss, I don't think that Strauss necessarily would recognize this. There's a famous quote from Marx later in his life where he talks about how he really doesn't understand what a lot of Marxists are talking about. And I think that you could probably get that with Straussians as well, even though they call themselves Straussians. I don't know that Leo Strauss necessarily would call himself a Straussian. But because of that impact, I think that we see that particular esoteric tradition having kind of a long reach into how people think about texts and philosophy today that is in contrast to sort of the plain reading of things. Part of what Strauss was doing was arguing against some of these Enlightenment ideals, but also against kind of the modern vision of liberalism and science. He was a critic of Popper. He was a critic of Kuhn. He was a critic of positivist approaches more generally to scientific inquiry. And so he was really kind of you might think of kind of the Frankfurt Schoolers as being one brand of anti-Enlightenment, but I think Strauss was another brand of this anti-Enlightenment, anti-liberal thinker who really thought we needed to return to classicist, classical versions, looking at classical texts and interpreting them in very deep ways, trying to uncover deep meanings from classical texts that would guide our behaviors and our politics today. Part of whether or not you agree with Strauss's kind of more esoteric views of texts, it's really hard to get away from his key point, which is that interpretation is never neutral. The degree to which a text is true or not true is kind of moot. The question is how and to what depth you're willing to engage in an interpretive act. We could bring that into the view of kind of semiotics of the late 20th century. These are folks like Umberto Eco, who talked about readerly and writerly texts. So we talked a little bit earlier, if you pick up something like T.S. Eliot, there's a lot of interpretive process. That how do you feel about this text when you read it? What are the particular words this person is using? You bring a lot to that text as a reader, and so it is what Eco might have called a readerly text. It's really designed for you to be able to build your own interpretation around it. If you pick up something like a Chilton repair manual, there's only so much interpretation that goes into which way the brake pads should go into the thing that holds it, the cylinder. I knew I'd come up with it there. I shouldn't use metaphors when I haven't touched brake pads in a long time. So, when it says to insert it this way, I don't think I'm going to say how I feel about that. It doesn't really matter. There's only so much interpretation you bring to it. You're still bringing interpretation to it, of course. But for Eco, this would be more of a writerly text. So there are, especially for the semioticians, the question of the degree to which we engage in interpretation was a piece of this. And regardless of whether it's Strauss or Umberto Eco, the question remains kind of the conditions under which meaning is produced, right? We're looking for what is that process of drawing meaning out of it. That is the central question of exegesis, is that drawing out of meaning. So let's skip over to a different kind of, it's not a tradition, a different grouping of ways of thinking about interpretation. And I'm trying to think, I should know this, but I don't offhand, whether Strauss actually looked at some of the things that Jonathan Swift wrote. So you probably know Jonathan Swift through his, Lilliputians and the Irish eating their babies and that sort of thing. But his first work was really a complaint about people using, what do you call them? Spark notes. I think that's, in my day, they were Cliff Notes. He was really down on folks reading, blurbs. And today, actually, I get fed these ads from a company, I don't know who it is, where, you can learn, they have books on tape where it's a full volume, but it's been brought down to, Baudelarized, or at least summarized down to like 30 minutes on high speed that you can listen to during your training in the morning, so that when you go into the office, you can reference this, whatever the popular trendy business book is today. And so you can read 30 books in 30 days that way and seem like you're smart. Swift wrote this piece where he argued, in the way that Swift writes, argued about, people who wanted to look smart but didn't want to do the hard intellectual labor of actually interpreting texts. And so that actually seems like it's fairly continuous with Strauss and with exegesis itself, but it points at another kind of tradition, which was this tradition of indexing and summarizing works. Swift is writing at a time after the large flood of printed material, and with it the large flood of summaries. And that could be something like encyclopedias, indexes, reference works, some of the things that we get today, which are kind of the, if you look at MIT Tech Notes, or there's a bunch of places where you might look where you get a summary of, interesting research of the day, and then you can go find the article, right? That's that happened kind of fairly early on in the Enlightenment, people writing summaries, so you kind of knew what was out there. Gazettes of the major stuff that was being written in what was emerging as scientific journals would get kind of pushed into something that looked a little bit more like an encyclopedia and had like brief versions of it. So that's what Swift was reacting against, was this kind of flood of new ways of making the broad and huge literature into something that was more portable, more searchable, and more democratic in some sense, where more people had access to all this stuff. But that's not just the Enlightenment. I think you had a rush of it after Gutenberg's press. But there's a long tradition of needing to do that summarization and indexing. That kind of work was probably originally done by the librarians at Alexandria and other large libraries. Alexandria is usually our touch point as the largest of these, right? And you have thousands of scrolls. You probably personally don't have thousands of scrolls, but you probably have some books. Even today, even young people buy physical books. And anybody that has books or records, you probably don't have records or CDs. I don't think people really, unless you're being kind of silly about it. I have a teenager who now has a record collection, so maybe you do. But you probably have gone through this process where you say, okay, how am I going to sort these on the shelf, right? Do I do it by subject? Do I say, okay, broadly, I have a bunch of books. Off camera, off to your left, is right now I don't have shelves in this office. And so I need to build some shelves. And so I have piles of books. They're actually in boxes mostly. But I know in that mass of books, say 5,000 or 6,000 books in this part of the house. I know roughly what's in there. I kind of, back in my brain, remember buying a book by somebody. And so I know I can kind of picture the cover a little bit. And so that's kind of what librarians were like at the time. They kind of knew what was in everything in the library. It was only several thousand scrolls. And the idea behind, by the way, Alexandria was that if you came into Alexandria and you brought anything, you were supposed to bring a second copy and give it to the library. That's what we do with the Library of Congress now. When you publish a book, you're supposed to send them a copy of it. That's how they have so many books. So they probably have, we're starting to think about how they had acquired these texts, and they could then kind of, if someone came to them and said, I need to know this, they would say, oh, well, yeah, I think this might help you, right? They go to a shelf and kind of from memory know roughly what was inside of it. That memory needed to be externalized in some way, and so the earliest version of that was to come up with codes, and so they would tag these things. We think about folksonomies and tagging much later in the history of libraries, but really that was the first indexing trick, was to come up with symbols or colors, and you could kind of put it on the outside. If you had a scroll box, you could put it on the outside of the box, and if someone was looking for geography, they may not all be in the same place, they may not have a subject orientation to things, but you could look for everything that had like a little picture of probably would not be a picture of a globe, but you get the idea, a little picture of something that said this was about kind of geography or surveying, and you kind of had a set of codes that were developed, and you did that, and you had a way then of externalizing it both physically using technology, but also a way to train other librarians so it could be carried forward. Really, I think that we keep indexes, aside from how you index your book collection, you probably also have some kind of gut way of indexing your notes, at least I hope you do. So, for me, I think I've talked about this maybe at some point here, that I'm using a note-taking app called Obsidian, and it allows me to kind of take snippets of notes and tag them using hashtags and connect them in various ways. But all of us kind of think about these indexes. So that, for me, that my notes are my indexes, right? I summarize things in a way that I think might be useful. I point to the original. That's not just books and articles, but also kind of, or videos or experiences or meetings or ideas. Like, it really is my own index within a set of notes. And that kind of personal thing is kind of what happens at a social level as well. We need to find ways of indexing, that is pointing to the original materials in one way or another. And that always involves some kind of indication and some kind of summarization, right? So, when I write it, I might have a blurb that says why I think this was interesting, and then point to it, right? The two really big kind of innovations in indexing both came during the 13th century, one in Paris and one in Oxford, right around the same time. In Paris, you started to see the development of the concordance index. This is particularly for religious texts like the Bible, the idea of reverse. This is how you reverse an index. This is what you find at the back of a book, where you say, okay, these are the key terms within this text, or within this page, or within this chapter, and here's a way to link back to it. Only with the printing press did we have page numbers. Some people, like, for all of the many innovations of the printing press and the ways in which it changed how we interact with texts, one of them was page numbers. You could have a page number that was the same in Milan and in London, and so if you referenced a work, you could reference a particular page number and find exactly in the text what you were talking about. So by the 13th century, you were starting to already have concordances where you might not have it going to a page number, because we don't have the printing press yet, so you didn't really have page numbers, but you could have indexes that went to a book or went to a section that kind of reversed the main ideas and maybe alphabetized them. And that was being developed around Paris. At Oxford, they were talking about subject indexes, where they would say, okay, for example, in the Bible, if you want to find every mention of, seafood, that's a really bad example, but you could kind of look at the seafood section and it would point you to where in the Bible seafood was mentioned, or birds. If you wanted to look for all the birds in the Bible, and how any reference to any bird in the Bible, that's a good question. Is that a concordance? It might be if it mentions birds, but if you also include things like flight or metaphors for birds, then it would be more of a subject index. And so those two kinds of ideas of indexing every instance of a word in a text to a particular word, or groups of passages of ideas to a text into a particular subject, really forms the basis of early indexing. And once you have those tools, once you have those indexes, it really changes one of the ways we interpret text, right? We no longer start, to quote Alice in Wonderland, or to begin at the beginning and then when we come to the end, stop, right? That's not the only way to engage with the text anymore. Now you can instead use the index to kind of go to the piece that you need directly, and that's also what a search engine does. It uses an index to go to a document that you need, and that's different than browsing, right? And so it fundamentally changed the way in which we use texts and the ways in which we interpret them, from being a linear process to a process of querying a text, but really querying the world, right? We now try to kind of use something to get us to a piece of the text, and that's a very different way of interpreting the world. So in the 20th century, we start to move towards statistical methods that allow for that kind of indexing. So concordance indexing becomes the identification of key terms, keywords, and that's how we get things like something called TF-IDF, which is term frequency inverse document frequency. This idea that, first we get this idea that maybe we just count how often a word shows up in a text, and that if you do that, you find that in English texts, all texts are about and the. And so that's not very useful. So you have something called TF-IDF where you say, okay, what are terms? Just slightly different than words, but we've run into that before if you've taken 510 with me and talked about lemmatizing text. But what are terms that show up more often than others? And that's how we get TF-IDF, this idea that what are the important words in a particular document that differentiates it from the entire universe of potential documents. And summarization follows fairly naturally from that. Like once you have those key terms in a document, or what are the key ideas that come from that, and how do those relate, right? And then Google gave us one more step further than that, which is who is linking to this and in what ways. In this case, it's a very explicit link. It's hyperlinks, but this is the beginning of citation structures, which we'll talk about a little bit later. Those became central because you could not only talk about, because when you look at a citation, usually you have a commentary that goes with it. So you're engaging in some kind of summarization as that process, and you can kind of pile on that in terms of both authority, in the case of Google and PageRank, but also in terms of just interpretation. If I'm going to link to someone, chances are right around that hyperlink and the keywords around it, there is some hint as to what the document is about or why it's important. So citation structures allowed us to add new layers on top of that query process. And no doubt you see where this is leading, which is if you look at the development of large language models, they come out of this process of extracting meaning from those texts. The idea is if you can extract the meaning, you can then recombine and generate that meaning by synthesizing some of those key terms together to answer a query more directly. So rather than I give you a query, you give me a citation that goes directly to a link that links me to a document that hopefully is related to that original query. I give you a query, and that gives the LLM an environment of keywords and key concepts, and it kind of puts those back in by running it through a process that makes it look like language, puts that back into something that looks like language that contains some of these key subject areas around the question that you've asked, and spits that back out as something that looks like it's answering you. But really, that's just I don't want to say just, because it's a fairly substantial move forward, but it is a search engine on steroids. It's kind of the ultimate outcome of this indexical process, which hints at something that we're getting at here, which is sometimes that indexing itself is really a form of interpretation, right? By seeing what the key terms are and the key ideas are. That's the same kind of questions humans are asking when they're engaged in interpreting a text. So this is a different tradition. This is the information science tradition, but it is also by understanding the structural nature of a text and the statistical relationship of those collections of data about a text, you are still engaged in a process of interpretation. It is not the same as exegesis. It is not as qualitative. It does not require the same kind of pattern matching for now, but I suspect those two are converging fairly quickly. So a final tradition or pathway is this idea of content analysis, which emerges during the last century as a way of systematically extracting information from text by transforming them into data. So unlike exegesis, which kind of embraces this idea of ambiguity, content analysis seeks to flatten it, to eliminate it, to get rid of that ambiguity and represent things in clear counts of concepts or numbers. The goal is consistency, so that you have different analysts following the same set of rules, a rule book that should arrive at the same conclusion. We're getting back to this issue of reliability. Exegesis is antithetical to reliability, whereas good content analysis of manifest content should result in the same outcome no matter who does that analysis. And so although you are chopping off some of the potential for understanding, especially esoteric or latent meanings, you are getting out of it something that you can use comparatively. The whole point of this is that measurement is for comparison. And so if you want to do that kind of measurement, content analysis gives you comparable measures. And maybe to give an example of this, I'll tell you the first content analysis project that I was involved in as a graduate student way back in the last millennia. I worked with a couple of researchers, Tony Giffard and Nancy Rivenberg at the University of Washington, and they were working on a project to try to figure out what the effect of hosting the Olympics was on a city, right? They wanted to know kind of, I think actually that some of this was encouraged by the Olympic Committee, who was trying to convince people to host the Olympics. And there's kind of this broad feeling that, like, if you host the Olympics, it's a great reputation boost for your city. Not only do you get to build all these stadiums, but people will see it on TV around the world and they'll want to come to your city. And so they were trying to figure out if that was true. And so they looked at, I think altogether several thousand articles off of wire stories around, newswire stories around various Olympic events. And I think we did 3 different Olympic events. Not credited on this. I was a part of the army of downtrodden grad students who were brought in to engage in this content analysis. And this was our job was to go. You could get wire stories by going to the library and printing them. Like it was on the wire, so it was electronic. You did get to it through the internet, but you couldn't get it at home. They had just started to allow web access to LexisNexis, which got access to some of the wire stories. But if you actually wanted the full access to all the wire stories, you had to go into the library, and for each of the stories, you had to hit print. So literally, we went and printed thousands and thousands of pages and put them in 3-ring binders, and then we went through to look for we had developed a code book. We'd done that collaboratively. So we'd done a small chunk of them first in coding to try to figure out how we could code it. And then we had decided that one of the things we were going to look for were a set of keywords, and particularly the name of the city, right? So for example, there was a Rio Olympics that we were looking at. And so if it mentioned Rio de Janeiro, we then looked at the words, a certain number of words around it to decide what kinds of words were being used to describe Rio. And then we had some questions about those words. Is it a positive or a negative valence? Does it mention these categories of things like crime, things like entertainment, right? So we were trying to get at what it was saying about these cities, and we were trying to look a little bit about whether the stories were better before at the beginning, before the Olympics, after the Olympics, during the Olympics. So we're looking at some of the timepieces of this as well. So in the end, we would have a collection of data that said, okay, we have we were looking, I think, at 3 different cities. What did this say about this before and after? And we had about, I think the total was somewhere around 5,000 separate, individual mentions of each city, and then kind of a whole bunch of measures around the ways in which the city was being interpreted. So, for example, for Rio, did they talk about favelas and kind of poverty more before or after? Did the general feeling rise during the period in which it was held there? The answer is no, by the way, as I recall, that no, people were still, if anything, it brought a little bit more global attention to the vast disparities within Rio de Janeiro and of course Brazil more broadly. But it didn't do kind of what was promised and why the government had invested money in hosting. But we couldn't get that. We could hint at it, right? We could maybe read a lot. It's often the first process in content analysis is actually doing some of the more interpretive work and kind of bathing yourself in some of these, and doing some deep reading is usually a good first step. So we could kind of get a hint at that, and then it is trust me, bro. I mean, I don't want to dismiss purely interpretive work, but there is a lot of trust me, bro in there, and trust me, bro is great, particularly when you can back it up with quantitative data that then says, okay, this is what we thought, and here's 5,000 cases in which it's mentioned, and here's how people are interpreting those. And early on, is this positive or negative is a that's open to interpretation, right? And so we had to go through and say, engage in intercoder reliability, which is there are a couple of standard measures that say if you have some items where you're asking these questions in a code book, how often do coders agree with whether they fit into one slot or another? So I think we were just doing neutral, positive, negative for one of them, and you're not going to get 100% on that. Some people at one point, one human interpreter is going to say, well, you might think that's positive, but I think it's neutral. This is only 3 categories. Binary, you're going to have more agreement, but that's kind of built into some of the measures that code for intercoder reliability. But you might see that as positive, but when you say it's fine, I don't really think that's a good thing. I think it's just kind of okay. So I rate that as neutral. Once we did that with a small subset, we reworded a lot of our questions to try to figure out where that ambiguity was and iron that ambiguity out before we went and did the massive coding of thousands of articles. But you kind of have to that ironing out. And that happened through discussion. We had a bunch of people saying, okay, well, why did you, we literally sat down and spent, hours in a room saying, pulling out our sheets of paper because it was all done on paper and saying, okay, look on article number 387, on mention number 3, you got this, I got this. Why are we different on this? And so we would talk that through, and then we would figure out why we were different. And then we'd say, okay, so we need to reword this question in the code book so that we have a rubric so we don't run into this as we go forward, and we can reduce it a little bit more. And then we went back and recoded that section. Then we went back and recoded the whole thing, and we still ran and reported intercoder reliability, because you have to do that to show that that's as much a metric of your instrument as it is of what you're doing, right? Of saying, okay, we've thought about this in such a way that we have a reliable instrument for drawing out data. And then we can talk about it. Like we can say, okay, yes, when you host it in LA or you host it in Rio, those are going to be 2 different ways in which it affects the city. And here are some examples of that. And here are some explicit numbers about that, about how things changed or didn't change over that period. So that key process is in the operationalization of your codebook, and that codebook in many cases will be shared along with your data when you publish this. So you need to be as explicit as possible in that codebook. And there are coding items that exist that are standard items. I'll see if I can link to a catalog of some standard items that may be used for content analysis, for this kind of explicit content analysis. I should note here that positive negative is a tricky one. I shouldn't have maybe given that as an example, because you really, one of the key differences between interpretive processes of text analysis and traditional quantitative content analysis is that you are really only looking at manifest content. You should not bring any of your own understanding to the text. It should be something that is explicit and manifest on the page. So elsewhere, you can think about interpretation. But in this measurement, in order to operationalize it, you have to, as your starting point, you have to say, I am looking only at what I see on the page and not drawing on my own memory or my own influence or my own feelings about it, but really just trying to create an instrument here, a code book, that would work no matter who the person coding is. Any human should be able to look at, any native speaker of this language should be able to look at this and interpret the code book and be able to code the same way. Because of that, it lends itself somewhat to what was originally called computer-assisted content analysis, or computer-assisted text analysis, CATA. And there were a bunch of tools that came out that helped with this. And some of this was just really initially something that meant that you didn't have to write it on paper. So it might be just some way of tracking codes, and some way of making it easier to calculate intercoder reliability, some way of maybe identifying recurring terms. There was something called keyword in context, which if you had electronic text, you could say, do what I just did, right? Which is, look for every incidence of Brazil and pull it out with 50 words on either side. And that means that you're not having to literally go by hand. This is, if it's in electronic form, you can Control F and do at least a search. But otherwise, you're going by hand and looking for Brazil on the page. And that was actually a lot of our work, was not just kind of doing the actual coding, but making sure we didn't miss a mention along the way. So you could do something called keyword in context, which is still used. And again, in 5.10, we wrote a little routine that allowed us to do that, where you could see how it appears within surrounding text, for example. But then you also started to move towards approaches that were sort of dictionary approaches. So often you would say, in the codebook itself, do you mention this set of words? And I mentioned the word fine earlier on as whether that was good or neutral, right? Which just depends. There's a lot of regionality and personal difference in that, and context, which is not a good thing for content analysis. But especially early sentiment analysis, you could come up with a dictionary of words that tend to show up with different emotions. And so if you had those dictionaries, you could use that on a piece of text to say, what's the frequency of these happy sounding words? What's the frequency of these depressed sounding words? And you could use that a bit to do both categorization and to kind of rate particular chunks of texts or documents against a known dictionary of words. And again, now we start to meld back. Once you're starting to do frequencies of words, it's starting to feel a little bit like what we were talking about for information science. And so that, again, all these threads, this is why they're not traditions. They really do intersect in various ways. And then that leads us into AI. Sentiment analysis was really bad for a long time, to the point where I would scoff when I saw it, even a couple of years ago. I think now it's gotten much better. But, so we kind of moved towards more involved and complicated ways of doing this that were also more valid as well. I'll close with a kind of a brief observation here, which is I've been talking here about text as letters on a page or words on a page. But especially within media studies and communication, often we talk about texts as being media text. It doesn't really matter whether it's in words or visual or filmic or audio. All of that, all those are texts. They're documentations of thoughts that have been somehow put in a form, right? So a TikTok or an Instagram reel is still a text. It's not in text, but it's still a text. But that was always kind of a trick of wordplay a little bit. That's not really as true now. And as we go along, I'll talk a little bit about using LLMs in various ways. I think one of the most useful and interesting ways from the analytical perspective is that trick of calling everything a text is a lot easier when you can take a transcript from a YouTube video or from an interview. That is, one of the things that LLMs have been fairly good at is translating from one thing to another. And if anyone has played with the what's in this picture kind of a thing, you can do some interesting stuff there, right? Like if you have a system that recognizes objects and can describe a scene from a picture, that opens you up to using some of the tools that we have a longer history of in terms of textual analysis to then interpret the picture. Now we're missing a whole lot. We're certainly not getting the kind of interpretation that art historians do. But for certain kinds of problems where you want to have comparable quantitative measures, being able to translate a video or an image into written word really kind of moves you in interesting directions. We haven't seen a ton of that yet, but it does kind of push you towards that, and it allows you to do some of the long historical traditions from exegesis all the way, well, maybe less that because you have to really consider the role of the LLM into that, but it really does move you into more quantitative approaches that you can use to analyze non-written work. And that role of LLMs as a kind of accelerator, as a kind of shortcut, as long as it's mindful and as long as you're very explicit about how you're using it and you're tracking the degree to which it works. I just worked on a project with a friend that was a complicated Excel sheet. It has nothing to do with research, but as I walked away from it, I said to her, okay, you need to spot check this, right? And she was like, oh yeah, I know. This was something that would have an effect on millions of people and have an effect of tens of millions of dollars. And so you can't trust that whatever it is you've done that's automatic is actually working unless you go back as a human and look at it. That has to be kind of the general rule for not just LLMs, but any automated process. And so as long as you're mindful about the way you use it, LLMs can be a really nice accelerator of all of these traditions, give you a new tool that you can use to kind of open up your analysis process. None of these processes are new. This kind of process of exegesis, kind of thinking about meaning, this question of indexing, which talks about indexing and summarizing, about how things can be found and navigated and reassembled, or content analysis, this question of how you can measure and compare various texts. None of that changes, but it does allow you to kind of accelerate that and build into new methodological processes where you can kind of get at larger scales, faster speeds, so you can do this analysis as kind of part of a pipeline and automate it so that you have responses. That's less important for research and more for practice, that automation and ongoing process, but it is extraordinarily powerful when done well. We have to use our contemporary tools, the new tools that are not just new now, but new, it seems like every month or two. We should use these wisely and recognize that it isn't that we're inventing new ways of reading or new ways of finding meaning in a text. We're really just kind of inheriting old ones and using them in different ways.